January 17, 1943. Tunisia, the western Dorsal Mountains. The morning air hung cold and thin over the jagged hills, carrying with it the scent of diesel and scorched earth. American tankers of the 1st Armored Division crouched behind their M4 Shermans, watching through field glasses as the German column withdrew across the valley floor. The metallic screech of tracks echoed between the ridges, a sound that had become the signature of Panzer supremacy in North Africa. But this morning something was different. One of the massive shapes had stopped moving. Its engine had fallen silent. The crew had abandoned it in haste, leaving behind not just a disabled machine, but a secret the Wehrmacht had fought desperately to protect. By noon, American engineers surrounded the hulking vehicle. It sat like a wounded predator, its angular armor plates catching the North African sun. This was no ordinary Panzer. This was Tiger Weyers, tank number 131 of the 504th Heavy Panzer Battalion, the first of Hitler's invincible wonder weapons to fall intact into Allied hands. The Americans approached cautiously, rifles raised, half expecting an ambush, but the tank remained still, silent. The hatches stood open. Inside, the crew compartment smelled of sweat, oil, and something else: desperation. Technical Sergeant William McCollum was the first to climb inside. His hands ran across the controls, feeling the precision of German engineering beneath his fingertips. The gun breech was massive, an 88mm cannon that could punch through any Allied tank from over a mile away. The armor plates measured nearly 4 inches thick on the front glasses. Everything about the Tiger spoke of overwhelming power, of technological superiority, of invincibility, made manifest in steel. But as McCollum studied the fuel gauges and inspected the engine compartment, a troubling pattern began to emerge. The fuel tanks were enormous, over 500 liters of capacity, yet according to the markings on the gauge, they had been filled recently. The crew had abandoned this mechanical monster not because of combat damage, but because they had simply run out of gas. The discovery rippled through American intelligence channels like an electric shock. Within days, the Tiger was being carefully transported to the rear, destined for detailed examination in England and eventually the United States. But the question that haunted every officer who inspected it was the same question McCollum had asked himself in that first moment. How could a tank this powerful, this heavily armored, this feared, be brought to a halt by something as mundane as an empty fuel tank? The answer lay not in a single design flaw, but in the entire philosophy that had birthed the Tiger into existence. To understand why this 70-ton behemoth could barely travel 120 miles on a full tank of fuel, one must first understand the intoxicating dream that possessed the German High Command in the years before the war turned against them. In the winter of 1941, German tanks had pushed to the gates of Moscow. Panzer divisions had swept across the steppes of Russia with a speed that shattered Soviet defenses. The Blitzkrieg doctrine, lightning war, had validated every assumption the Wehrmacht had made about modern combat. Tanks were not merely mobile gun platforms, they were the spearhead of a new form of warfare, combining speed, firepower, and psychological shock into a single devastating instrument. German engineers, emboldened by battlefield success, began to dream bigger. If medium tanks could achieve such results, what could heavy tanks accomplish? What if Germany built a vehicle so powerful, so heavily armored, that no enemy weapon could destroy it? What if German technical superiority could be crystallized into a single, perfect machine? The Tiger. I emerged from this fever dream of invincibility. Designed by Henschel and manufactured beginning in August 1942, it represented everything the Third Reich believed about its own destiny. The tank weighed 54 tons in its initial configuration, later variants pushing past 60 tons. Its frontal armor ranged from 100 millimeters to 120 millimeters in thickness, more than double that of the standard Panzer IV. The 88mm KWK-36 L-56 gun, adapted from the legendary Flak 88 anti-aircraft cannon, could penetrate 100 millimeters of armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. In comparison, the American M4 Sherman's 75mm gun struggled to penetrate even 60 millimeters of armor beyond 1,000 meters. On paper, the Tiger was unstoppable. German propaganda films showed the tanks crushing through obstacles, shells bouncing harmlessly off their thick hides. Heinrich Himmler personally observed production, declaring the Tiger the embodiment of Germanic genius. Hitler himself micromanaged design details, insisting on ever thicker armor and more powerful guns. The Führer's obsession with technical specifications bordered on mystical. He believed that superior technology could compensate for Germany's shrinking manpower and dwindling resources. The Tiger became not just a weapon, but a symbol. It was proof that one German soldier, equipped with superior tools, could defeat 10 enemy soldiers. It was the mechanical manifestation of racial superiority theory, but symbols require feeding. The Maybach HL230 P45 engine that powered the Tiger generated 690 horsepower, an impressive figure for 1942. Yet it was being asked to move a vehicle that, fully loaded with ammunition, fuel, and crew, weighed as much as 8 elephants. The transmission system, a complex 8-speed synchronized gearbox, represented advanced engineering, but it was temperamental and prone to failure. The overlapping road wheel system, designed to distribute weight and improve cross-country performance, collected mud, snow, and debris, frequently freezing solid in Russian winters. And then there was the fuel consumption. The Tiger's massive engine, laboring under tremendous weight, consumed fuel at a staggering rate. Under ideal conditions, traveling on roads at moderate speed, the Tiger managed approximately 1 kilometer per 2 liters of fuel. In combat conditions, crossing rough terrain or advancing at speed, consumption could triple. The tank's fuel tanks held 540 liters. Simple mathematics revealed the cruel truth. Even under optimal conditions, a Tiger could travel barely 200 kilometers before requiring refueling. In combat, that range shrank to 120 kilometers, 75 miles, sometimes less. The Americans who examined Tank 131 in Tunisia couldn't quite believe the numbers at first. They recalculated. They measured the fuel tanks again. They interviewed captured German tanker crews, thinking perhaps the Tiger was designed to operate alongside dedicated fuel trucks. But the reality was undeniable. The most feared tank in the German arsenal, the mechanical embodiment of Nazi military superiority, had an operational radius smaller than the distance between New York City and Philadelphia. A Sherman tank, by comparison, could travel nearly 200 miles on a full tank while carrying more ammunition and requiring less maintenance. For the young German tankers who crewed the Tigers, the reality of this design philosophy revealed itself not in intelligence reports or technical specifications, but in the grinding exhaustion of daily operations. They had expected to be the tip of the spear, the breakthrough force that would shatter enemy lines and restore the momentum of blitzkrieg. What they found instead was a machine that spent more time stationary than moving, more time waiting for fuel trucks than engaging the enemy. Oberleutnant Hans Müller of the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion recorded his experiences in a letter to his brother in April 1943, later captured by Soviet forces. "We call them the Tigers," he wrote, "but sometimes I think they are more like tethered lions. We can see the enemy, we can range them with our guns, but we cannot pursue. Always the fuel situation controls everything. We advance 20 kilometers, and then we must stop and wait. The supply trucks struggle to keep pace. Sometimes they do not arrive at all, destroyed by partisan attacks or Allied aircraft. And so we sit, this magnificent machine beneath us, and we wait like beggars for gasoline." The psychological impact of this limitation cannot be overstated. German tankers were an elite within the Wehrmacht. They had been told they commanded the finest fighting vehicle ever created. They had been promised that German engineering would guarantee victory. The Tiger's thick armor did indeed protect them. American and British tank shells frequently bounced off without penetrating. The 88mm gun did indeed destroy enemy tanks with terrifying efficiency. Tank versus tank engagements, the Tiger held an overwhelming advantage. A single Tiger platoon could, in theory, hold off an entire Allied tank company. But wars are not won by defensive efficiency. Wars are won by operational mobility, by the ability to exploit breakthroughs, to encircle enemy formations, to maintain pressure and initiative. And in this crucial dimension, the Tiger was fundamentally crippled. Its massive weight destroyed roads and bridges. Its narrow operational radius meant it could not participate in rapid advances. Its mechanical complexity meant that breakdowns were frequent and repairs time-consuming. German tankers found themselves in the surreal position of commanding the most powerful tank in the world while being strategically irrelevant. The experience of the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion in Tunisia illustrates this painful paradox. Arriving in North Africa in November 1942, the battalion's Tigers initially achieved devastating successes. At the Battle of Tabourba, a single Tiger destroyed 11 Allied tanks in one engagement, suffering no damage in return. German commanders were ecstatic. The reports seemed to confirm everything the propaganda had promised. But as the North African campaign progressed, a different pattern emerged. Tigers would engage the enemy, achieve local tactical success, then be forced to withdraw, not because of combat losses, but because they lacked the fuel to continue fighting. The Americans and British learned to simply bypass German Tiger positions, letting their superior operational mobility dictate the terms of engagement. The captured Tiger 131 had been abandoned during one such withdrawal. The crew had fought well. They had damaged multiple Allied vehicles. But when the order came to retreat, they discovered their fuel reserves were too low to reach the fallback position. Rather than allow the Tiger to fall into enemy hands running, they had attempted to destroy it, setting demolition charges that failed to detonate properly. The vehicle's transmission had been damaged by a British shell, leaving it immobile. And so they fled on foot, leaving behind the tank they had believed invincible. For American tankers, the discovery of the Tiger's fuel limitations produced a complex mix of relief and contempt. They had feared these machines. Radio chatter from early encounters with Tigers in North Africa conveyed genuine terror, the realization that the Sherman's gun couldn't penetrate frontal armor, that a Tiger could destroy them from ranges beyond their own weapons' effectiveness. But as American intelligence officers shared the data from the captured Tiger, a different understanding emerged. The Tiger wasn't invincible. It was impractical. It was the product of a military philosophy that prioritized individual technical superiority over operational sustainability. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson Hawkins, an American armor officer who studied the captured Tiger at the testing grounds in Maryland, later wrote in his report, "The German Tiger tank represents the culmination of a certain approach to warfare, the belief that qualitative superiority can compensate for quantitative inferiority. Technically, it is a remarkable achievement. The engineering is impressive, but strategically it is almost worthless. You cannot win a war with a tank that cannot reach the battlefield. You cannot maintain an offensive with vehicles that require 5 times the logistical support of standard tanks. The Germans have built a fortress on tracks. It is impressive. It is formidable. But it cannot move, and therefore it cannot win." The fuel crisis that hobbled the Tiger was not merely a design oversight. It was a symptom of a larger resource catastrophe consuming the Third Reich. By 1943, when Tigers were entering combat in significant numbers, Germany was already losing the war of industrial production. The nation's access to petroleum reserves had always been limited. Romania provided crude oil, but the quantities were insufficient for the Wehrmacht's expanding needs. Synthetic fuel production from coal had been ramped up dramatically, but the process was expensive, energy-intensive, and produced fuel of inconsistent quality. German petroleum reserves in 1943 stood at approximately 7 million tons annually, barely half of what military planners had identified as necessary to sustain operations on multiple fronts. The Luftwaffe consumed enormous quantities of aviation fuel. The Kriegsmarine needed fuel for its U-boats and surface vessels. The regular Wehrmacht divisions required fuel for their trucks, half-tracks, and standard Panzer models. Into this desperate shortage, the German High Command had introduced a vehicle that consumed fuel at rates that would have been extravagant even in peacetime. A single Tiger battalion, typically consisting of 45 tanks, required approximately 15,000 liters of fuel per day during active operations. That was equivalent to the daily fuel consumption of an entire infantry division's motor transport. The Wehrmacht's logistical apparatus, already strained to breaking point by the vast distances of the Eastern Front, simply could not support such demands. Fuel convoys became priority targets for Allied air attacks. Partisan forces in occupied territories specialized in ambushing supply columns. The Tigers, sitting at the forward positions, received their fuel allocations only after headquarters units, communications vehicles, and standard Panzer battalions had been supplied. Often there was nothing left. The German solution to this crisis was tragically typical of Nazi operational planning. They blamed the crews. Tanker commanders received instructions on fuel-efficient driving techniques. They were ordered to minimize idling, to plan routes carefully, to avoid unnecessary maneuvering. Training manuals stressed that Tigers were to be employed as defensive strongpoints, not as mobile breakthrough units. In effect, the Wehrmacht attempted to solve a fundamental design and resource problem through operational restrictions. They had built a racehorse and then ordered it to pull a plow. The psychological toll on German tankers manifested in increasingly bitter letters home, in declining morale, and in a spreading cynicism about German invincibility. Hans Rudel, a decorated panzer commander who served on the Eastern Front, later recalled, "We loved and hated the Tiger in equal measure. Loved it because when we could fight, we were nearly invincible. Hated it because we spent most of our time waiting, watching inferior enemy tanks maneuver around us while we sat immobile, fuel gauges reading empty. The Tiger made cowards of us, not through fear of the enemy, but through the constant fear of being stranded, of becoming a stationary target, of abandoning our vehicle in retreat." The Americans who studied the captured Tiger came to understand something profound about the nature of the conflict they were fighting. This was not merely a war of armies or ideologies. It was a war of systems, of industrial capacity, resource management, and logistical efficiency. The Tiger represented the culmination of one system, centralized, obsessed with technical perfection, willing to sacrifice practicality for symbolic power. The Sherman tank, by contrast, represented a different philosophy entirely. The M4 Sherman was not superior to the Tiger in any direct measure of combat performance. Its armor was thinner, its gun was weaker. In a one-on-one engagement, a Tiger would destroy a Sherman almost every time. But the Sherman embodied advantages that transcended individual combat capability. It was reliable. Mechanical failures were rare, and when they occurred, repairs were straightforward. It was mass-produced. American factories churned out Shermans by the thousands, ensuring that losses could be rapidly replaced. It was fuel-efficient. A Sherman could travel twice the distance of a Tiger on the same amount of fuel. And crucially, it was strategically mobile. Shermans could be transported by standard rail cars, could cross bridges that would collapse under a Tiger's weight, could operate in terrain that Tigers could not access. The captured Tiger became a traveling exhibit within American military intelligence circles. Officers from every branch studied it, not primarily to understand its strengths, but to understand the mentality that had created it. They examined the intricate transmission system, beautifully engineered but prone to failure and nearly impossible to repair in field conditions. They noted the overlapping road wheels, theoretically superior for weight distribution, but a maintenance nightmare that required the removal of multiple wheels to access damaged inner wheels. They measured the width of the vehicle, 3.7 meters, too wide for most European rail tunnels, necessitating the removal and replacement of outer road wheels for rail transport. Every design choice revealed the same pattern. German engineers had optimized for performance in ideal conditions while ignoring the realities of sustained operations. The Tiger was a tank designed for demonstrations, for propaganda films, for short, decisive engagements under controlled circumstances. It was not designed for the grinding, continuous operations that characterized modern warfare. It was not designed for supply lines stretching thousands of miles. It was not designed for a long war of attrition against opponents with vastly superior industrial capacity. American intelligence officers compiled their findings into reports that circulated throughout the Allied command structure. The psychological impact was significant. Allied troops had feared the Tiger, had spoken of it in near mythical terms. Now they understood its limitations. The training updated accordingly. Don't engage Tigers head-on. Use mobility to flank them. Force them to maneuver, consuming their limited fuel. Bypass them when possible, knowing their operational radius won't allow sustained pursuit. The Tiger transformed from an invincible monster into a dangerous but ultimately manageable threat. But the fuel consumption crisis revealed something deeper than tactical vulnerabilities. It exposed the fundamental unsustainability of the Nazi war machine itself. The Tiger was not an anomaly. It was a symbol, a crystallization of everything the Third Reich had become by 1943. Germany had built an empire through rapid conquest, through the looting of occupied territories, through the exploitation of slave labor. The entire economic model depended on continuous expansion, on capturing new resources to feed a war machine that consumed more than the nation could produce. When that expansion halted, when the Wehrmacht could no longer push forward, could no longer capture new oil fields and industrial centers, the system began to collapse inward. The Tiger tanks, sitting immobile for lack of fuel, represented this collapse in miniature. They were powerful, impressive, technologically advanced, and utterly unable to function because the resource base needed to sustain them no longer existed. German soldiers, witnessing this breakdown, experienced a cognitive dissonance that shook their faith in the Nazi project. They had been promised a 1,000-year Reich built on German superiority. They had been told that sacrifice and discipline would lead to inevitable victory. But as they sat in their immobilized Tigers, watching American and British tanks maneuver freely in the distance, the propaganda rang increasingly hollow. The technological superiority was real. Their tanks truly were more powerful. But power without mobility was irrelevant. Superiority without sustainability was a fantasy. The contrast with American logistics became starker with each passing month. While German Tigers sat idle awaiting fuel, American tank columns advanced with dedicated fuel trucks integrated into every formation. American supply chains stretched from factories in Detroit to battlefields in Europe and the Pacific, functioning with a reliability that German commanders could barely comprehend. The United States produced not just more tanks, but more fuel, more spare parts, more of everything. American tankers rarely worried about running out of fuel. When they did encounter supply difficulties, the system adapted rapidly. Fuel depots proliferated, pipeline systems were constructed, aerial resupply was implemented when ground transport was interrupted. Captain Rudolf Baer, captured in Normandy in June 1944, expressed his bewilderment during interrogation. "We would destroy 5 of your tanks, and 10 more would appear. We would retreat to conserve fuel, and your tanks would pursue. We would establish defensive positions, and your artillery would have unlimited ammunition to bombard us. We fought well. We had superior equipment, but you had everything. Everything. It was like fighting the ocean. Endless, overwhelming. Our Tiger destroyed your Shermans easily, but then it needed fuel, and the fuel didn't come, and more Shermans came instead." The symbolic power of fuel, of energy, of mobility, of the ability to sustain action became a recurring motif in how both sides understood the war. For the Germans, the empty fuel gauge represented the dying of their imperial dreams. For the Americans, it represented the vindication of their industrial system. The captured Tiger toured American military bases, and soldiers would stand in line to peer into its empty fuel tanks, to run their hands along its massive gun barrel, to comprehend viscerally the difference between impressive technology and sustainable warfare. One American lieutenant, Arthur Stevens, recorded his impressions after viewing the captured Tiger at a demonstration in England. "I expected to feel intimidated. This tank had destroyed so many of our boys, had been the subject of such fearful reports. But standing beside it, knowing that it could barely travel from London to Dover on a full tank, I felt something different. I felt sorry for the Germans. They had built a beautiful monster. But they had forgotten that monsters need to eat, and they had no food to give it." The fuel crisis that crippled the Tiger also created an unexpected psychological vulnerability in German tactical doctrine. As fuel became scarcer, Tiger battalions were increasingly employed as static defensive strongpoints rather than mobile assault units. They would be dug into hull-down positions, effectively functioning as heavily armored pillboxes. This preserved fuel, a stationary tank, consumes minimal fuel, but it also surrendered the initiative. German commanders could no longer mass Tigers for breakthrough operations. They could no longer use them to exploit weak points in Allied lines. The Tigers became reactive, waiting for the enemy to come to them. This defensive posture fundamentally contradicted the psychological training German tankers had received. They had been taught to be aggressive, to seize initiative, to drive forward with the confidence of superior technology. Now they waited. They watched Allied formations maneuver beyond their effective range, unable to pursue. They received orders to conserve fuel, to avoid unnecessary movement, to remain patient. For men who had joined the Panzer forces expecting to be warriors, the reality of becoming immobile guards was demoralizing. The Americans exploited this psychological shift ruthlessly. Allied intelligence had learned through interrogations and captured documents the details of German fuel shortages. Operational plans began to specifically target fuel infrastructure, refineries, storage depots, transport columns. Allied fighter bombers would strafe fuel trucks with particular intensity, knowing that each burning truck represented Tigers immobilized far from the front. Strategic bombing campaigns prioritized synthetic fuel plants in Germany, gradually strangling the supply at its source. By late 1944, the fuel situation had become catastrophic. German forces in France during Operation Overlord frequently abandoned Tigers not because of combat damage, but because they lacked the fuel to retreat. The Wehrmacht's operational reports from the Normandy campaign are filled with bitter references to fuel shortages and inadequate resupply. Tigers that could have been saved were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Each abandoned Tiger represented not just lost material, but lost faith, tangible evidence that the system could no longer support even its most prioritized weapons. The story of Tank 131, the first Tiger captured by the Americans, became emblematic of this larger narrative. After its initial examination in Tunisia, the tank was carefully shipped to Britain, where British engineers conducted exhaustive tests. They fired captured German ammunition from its gun, measured penetration capabilities, analyzed armor composition. They drove it repeatedly, meticulously, documenting fuel consumption under various conditions. The data confirmed American findings. This tank, magnificent in its engineering, was strategically hobbled by its appetite for fuel. But the British engineers noticed something else, something that added a poignant coda to the Tiger's story. Inside the tank, scratched into the metal near the gunner's position, was a message in German, Gott mit uns, God with us. It was the motto of the Wehrmacht, emblazoned on belt buckles and repeated in propaganda. But here, inside the abandoned Tiger, it read like an unanswered prayer. God, it seemed, had not been with them. Or perhaps more accurately, faith and superior technology had proven insufficient substitutes for fuel, for resources, for sustainable logistics. Tank 131 eventually made its way to the Bovington Tank Museum in England, where it remains today the only operational Tiger I in the world. It has been meticulously restored, its engine brought back to working condition. Occasionally, on special occasions, the museum will start the engine, will drive the tank a short distance. The sound is extraordinary, the roar of the Maybach engine, the metallic scream of tracks on pavement. For a brief moment, one can imagine the psychological impact this machine must have had on Allied soldiers encountering it for the first time. But then the engine stops. The tank sits silent. And the observers remember, this machine, with its full fuel tanks, could barely travel the length of England's southern coast before running dry. This mechanical predator, so fearsome in appearance, was tethered to fuel trucks like a balloon on a string. Its range was not measured in operational objectives achieved, but in kilometers of desperation between refuelings. The legacy of the Tiger's fuel crisis extended far beyond the immediate tactical implications. It influenced American tank design philosophy for generations. When American engineers designed the M26 Pershing heavy tank, they obsessively calculated range-to-weight ratios. When the post-war M48 and M60 tanks were developed, fuel efficiency remained a primary concern. The lesson had been learned. A tank that cannot reach the battlefield is not a tank at all. It is an expensive monument to engineering hubris. Soviet tank designers drew similar conclusions. The IS-2 and IS-3 heavy tanks, developed in response to the Tiger threat, were carefully designed to maintain operational mobility despite their heavy armor. Soviet engineers studied captured Tigers extensively, admiring the German engineering while rejecting the philosophical approach that had birthed it. Soviet heavy tanks would be powerful, yes, but they would also be practical, capable of sustained operations without requiring impossible logistical support. The psychological impact on surviving German tankers was profound and lasting. After the war, many former Tiger crewmen were interviewed by military historians. A recurring theme in these interviews was a sense of betrayal, not by their comrades or their commanders, but by the system that had promised them invincibility while denying them the resources to achieve it. They had been given the finest sword ever forged and then told they could only swing it a handful of times before resting. They had been made elite warriors and then forced into the role of stationary targets. Günther Schneider, a Tiger commander captured in 1945, perhaps expressed it most eloquently in a post-war interview. "We were told we were the tip of the spear, but a spear must thrust forward. A spear that cannot move is merely a stake in the ground." We sat in our Tigers watching the war pass us by, powerful and irrelevant. That is what I remember most, not the fear, not the combat, but the terrible feeling of irrelevance, of possessing overwhelming force that could not be brought to bear because we lacked the fuel to move. There is a deeper symbolism in the Tiger's empty fuel tanks, one that extends beyond military history into the realm of philosophical truth. The Tiger represented the culmination of a particular kind of human ambition, the belief that technical excellence, that superior design, that raw power, could overcome systemic limitations. It was the mechanical embodiment of the Nietzschean Superman concept: quality over quantity, excellence over adequacy, domination through superiority. But reality proved indifferent to such ambitions. The Tiger's sophisticated transmission could not create fuel where none existed. Its thick armor could not protect against the slow starvation of supply lines. Its powerful gun could not shoot farther than its fuel tanks could carry it. The universe, it turned out, cared nothing for elegance of design. It cared for sustainability, for balance, for systems that could endure. The American approach, building adequate tanks in overwhelming numbers, ensuring those tanks had the fuel to keep moving, creating a logistical system that prioritized sustainability over perfection, was less inspiring to propaganda filmmakers. A Sherman was not beautiful in the way a Tiger was beautiful. It did not represent transcendent engineering. It was merely practical, reliable, sufficient. But sufficiency, when sustained and multiplied, proved far more powerful than isolated excellence. This was the lesson the Germans learned too late, the lesson written in every abandoned Tiger, every empty fuel gauge, every immobilized battalion. Power without sustainability is illusion. Excellence without resources is fantasy. The most sophisticated weapon ever built becomes useless when it cannot reach the battlefield. And in the end, wars are not won by the finest individual soldiers or the best individual weapons. They are won by systems, by industrial capacity, by logistical networks, by the unglamorous work of supplying fuel and ammunition and spare parts day after day, month after month, until the enemy's system breaks and yours continues functioning. The captured Tiger 131 sits in its museum today as a monument to this truth. Children press their faces against the viewing barriers, awed by its massive size, its thick armor, its intimidating presence. Historians and veterans stand quietly, reading the informational placards that detail its specifications. But the most important number, the one that tells the real story, is often overlooked: 120 miles. That was the distance between invincibility and irrelevance. That was the gap between propaganda and reality. That was how far the Third Reich's most fearsome weapon could travel before it became nothing more than a very expensive roadblock. American tankers who faced Tigers learned to respect them without fearing them. They learned to see past the propaganda to the practical reality. They learned that a tank that could not pursue was not truly victorious, no matter how many enemies it destroyed. They learned that mobility was a form of armor, that operational range was a kind of firepower, that logistics was the ultimate deciding factor in mechanized warfare. And they learned something else, something more profound: that abundance, that sustainability, that the capacity to keep supplying and replacing and supporting, these were not signs of weakness or industrial crudeness. They were the actual expressions of power. The ability to field 1,000 adequate tanks would always defeat 100 perfect tanks that couldn't reach the battle. The capacity to ensure every tank had fuel was more valuable than thick armor. The system that could sustain operations month after month would outlast the system built on fantasies of technical superiority. This was the truth written in the empty fuel tanks of every captured and abandoned Tiger. This was the lesson that would reshape military doctrine for generations. This was the reality that no amount of propaganda or technological sophistication could overcome. The Tiger could only travel 120 miles on a full tank, and in that limitation lay the epitaph for an entire philosophy of warfare, an entire ideology of superiority, an entire empire built on the assumption that excellence alone could compensate for unsustainable ambition. The tank sits silent now, preserved and maintained. Its fuel tanks are empty. They always were, really. That was always the story, the most fearsome weapon of the Third Reich, brought low not by enemy action, but by the simple, inexorable mathematics of consumption. Power without sustenance is merely performance, and when the fuel runs out, even the mightiest predator becomes prey. That is what the Americans realized when they captured Tiger 131 in the hills of Tunisia. That is what the empty fuel gauge revealed. That is the truth that no amount of armor could protect against, no gun could shoot away, no engineering brilliance could overcome. In the end, the war would be won not by those with the best tanks, but by those who could keep their tanks moving. And the Tiger, for all its fearsome reputation, could barely move at all.